dream in time gone by.
Hi there, Susan Boyle here.
Hi, Susan Boyle here.
Hi there, Susan Boyle here.
In a story as heartbreaking as it is revealing, Susan Boyle's life was overshadowed by a devastating medical misjudgment that lasted more than half a century. Born in 1961 in Blackburn, Scotland, Susan was long believed to have suffered brain damage due to a brief deprivation of oxygen during birth. For 51 years, this misdiagnosis shaped how she was treated, how she saw herself, and how society perceived her. It wasn't until 2013, in a life-altering twist, that doctors discovered the truth. Susan wasn't brain damaged at all, but rather living with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder. In her own words, it was a blessing in disguise, a realization that finally gave her clarity on her behavior and struggles. For someone who had spent her life being misunderstood, labeled, and dismissed, this diagnosis wasn't just a revelation, it was a liberation. She described finally feeling more relaxed about herself and how others would understand her better, but the weight of decades living under a false label left deep scars. Autism, particularly Asperger's, often brings heightened anxiety, sensory, sensitivity, and difficulties with social cues. And for Boyle, these traits had gone untreated and misinterpreted, fueling years of emotional hardship. Her diagnosis didn't just explain her past, it challenged the public to reconsider everything they thought they knew about her. It was the beginning of a redefinition, not just of Susan Boyle the artist, but of Susan Boyle the woman, the fighter, and the survivor. As Susan stepped into her truth, the world began to see her not as someone damaged or odd, but as someone incredibly strong for carrying so much pain with so much grace. In what should have been the most innocent time of her life, Susan Boyle endured a childhood that was nothing short of torment. School, a place meant to foster learning, friendship, and personal growth, became her battleground. Relentlessly bullied for being different, Susan found herself the target of both cruel classmates and, shockingly, dismissive teachers. Kids didn't just whisper behind her back, they beat her, called her names, and treated her as if she were broken. It wasn't just the physical bullying that hurt, it was the emotional warfare of being made to feel unworthy, isolated, and defective. In an era when little was known or accepted about neurodiversity, her emotional sensitivity and learning challenges were misunderstood. Instead of support, she was labeled hyperactive, a word that reduced her to a nuisance instead of a child in need of understanding. Her mother often came to the school in desperation, trying to protect her daughter from what had become a war zone. But even teachers contributed to the abuse, telling her to shut up and enforcing silence where she most needed expression. Years later, Susan would reveal she endured daily beatings, not just from classmates, but also verbal degradation from adults she was supposed to trust. The trauma of those years didn't end when the school bell rang. It lived in her, shaping her self-worth and social fears. Yet in the midst of this darkness, a glimmer of resilience began to form. The very adversity that threatened to break her would later become the foundation of her emotional performances, fueling the raw power that would one day silence audiences around the world. But the scars remained, reminding her and us that before the applause, there was pain, and before the stardom, there was survival. Beyond the schoolyard cruelty and public misunderstanding, Susan Boyle's early life was further complicated by an invisible adversary, epilepsy. As a young girl, she suffered frequent seizures, leading to fainting spells and medical confusion. That left both her and her family scrambling for answers in a time when the condition was widely stigmatized and misunderstood. Instead of being met with empathy, her seizures became ammunition for bullies who used every episode as an excuse to torment her further. Her parents, overwhelmed and unsure of how to protect their daughter, responded with intense sheltering. Susan later described her upbringing as being wrapped in cotton wool, a well-meaning but suffocating kind of care that prevented her from exploring the world or developing independence. She wasn't allowed to go out like other kids. She was called touchy, and her emotional reactions were viewed as irrational rather than the valid responses of a young girl navigating neurological challenges. Even medical professionals failed her, perpetuating outdated myths about epilepsy being connected to mental instability. This only deepened the shame and confusion Susan carried carried through adolescence and into adulthood. Yet through this storm of misdiagnosis, bullying, and social restriction, Susan's will remained intact. She absorbed the emotional chaos like a sponge, one that would later wring itself out on the stage in front of millions. But those quiet early years, filled with whispered warnings, misunderstood symptoms, and lonely afternoons, created a pressure cooker inside her. And when she finally stepped into the limelight, all that pent-up trauma would pour out, not as rage, but as raw, unfiltered emotion that stopped audiences in their tracks. As if the public cruelty and medical challenges weren't enough, Susan Boyle's private life was also marred by a heartbreaking revelation. Her own father, a man she once described as very good, had a dark side that haunted her for years. In interviews later in life, Susan courageously admitted that while her father never meant to hurt her, he did. His temper was volatile, his hands at times violent, and the home she lived in, the very place meant to offer sanctuary, became another arena of fear. She carried that pain silently, believing it was her cross to bear, until she finally let go of the secret decades later as an act of healing. Even more tragically, some family sources attributed his abusive behavior to unresolved trauma from war, suggesting that he too was a broken man fighting unseen demons. But for Susan, the result was the same. She had to learn how to love someone who also caused her pain. This emotional paradox shaped the way she saw relationships for the rest of her life. Her parents' overprotectiveness, compounded by a father who didn't always know how to show love safely, created a confusing world of mixed messages. Love equals control, protection equals isolation, affection might hurt. These early emotional patterns would go on to define Susan's romantic fears and interpersonal struggles. And yet, even with all of this, she never lashed out or grew bitter. Instead, she poured these contradictions into her voice, singing from a place of deep emotional complexity that the world didn't just hear, they felt. Despite her emotional depth and immense capacity to love, Susan Boyle's romantic life has been defined not by joy, but by heartbreaking silence. At the age of 25, Susan fell for a man whom she believed might be her future, but her father didn't approve, deeming her too immature to navigate the complexities of a serious relationship. That disapproval shattered what little confidence she had, and the romance was cut short before it had the chance to blossom. Years later, she encountered another man, John, who proposed to her after just 7 weeks. But even that glimmer of hope was extinguished when he suddenly pulled away, leaving Susan devastated and questioning her own worth. She admitted it made her feel unattractive, invisible, and like life was slipping away while others moved forward. That haunting feeling of being undesired planted a seed of distrust that grew into years of romantic isolation. Though the world saw her as a shining star, adored by millions behind the scenes, she remained alone, never married, her heart protected by emotional armor forged in disappointment. Love, for Susan, was always just out of reach, something observed, not lived. And yet, in the deepest parts of her music, you can hear the echoes of that longing, the hope that someone, someday, might truly see her. Not the fame, not the voice, but the woman behind it all. In what might be the cruelest twist of fate, Susan Boyle's one true champion, her mother, Bridget, passed away just 2 years before the world finally heard her sing. For decades, Bridget had been the steady hand guiding Susan through rejection, ridicule, and self-doubt, always encouraging her to keep going even when everyone else laughed. But in 2007, Susan's world shattered when her mother died, leaving her in emotional freefall. The grief was so deep, so consuming, that Susan nearly gave up singing altogether. She later admitted that she only kept going because she had made a promise to audition one more time. That promise took her to the stage of Britain's Got Talent in 2009, where everything changed. But the one person she most wanted to see her moment of triumph was gone. In interview after interview, Susan spoke of the silence that followed her mother's death. Not just the literal quiet of an empty home, but the emotional vacuum that sucked all confidence and comfort out of her world. She was left alone with no one but her cat Pebbles to talk to. The loneliness, she said, was deafening. And yet through her tears and heartbreak, she honored her mother the only way she knew how, by walking out on that stage and delivering a performance that brought the world to its knees. Bridget never saw it, but she built it. Every note Susan sang was a tribute, every lyric a love letter, every applause an echo of her mother's faith. Susan Boyle's rise to fame was as meteoric as it was brutal. One moment, she was a middle-aged Scottish woman with a dream, and the next, she was the most downloaded woman in internet history. But the world's obsession came at a staggering cost. The overwhelming attention, paparazzi harassment, and media scrutiny shattered her fragile emotional stability. The night she lost the Britain's Got Talent final to dance troupe Diversity, rumors flew of a backstage breakdown. Reports surfaced that she screamed, threw water at a floor manager, and shouted, "I hate this show." That same night, police were called to her hotel after staff complained of bizarre behavior. Susan was ultimately admitted to the Priory, a mental health facility where she stayed for days of recovery. The UK's media regulator, Ofcom, launched an investigation into whether the show's producers had failed in their duty of care, exploiting a vulnerable woman for ratings. Even show judge Piers Morgan admitted the pressure was beyond anything he had seen. Susan went from anonymity to global icon in mere days, and the weight of that fame nearly destroyed her. She wasn't a seasoned performer, she was a deeply sensitive woman thrust into a hurricane of celebrity culture she never asked for. Fame gave her the spotlight, but it also stripped away her privacy, her peace, and nearly her sanity. With fame came fans, but not all of them were kind. Susan Boyle's newfound celebrity status invited a terrifying wave of intrusions into her personal life. In 2010, she returned home to find a teenage intruder standing on her staircase. Though nothing was stolen, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Just 2 years later, an obsessive fan tried to follow her into her hotel room after a performance, refusing to leave her alone even after she denied his request for an autograph. And back in her hometown, a place she returned to for comfort, a group of local teens began targeting her with stones, fire-lit paper, and verbal abuse. She was chased to her doorstep, harassed in the streets, treated like an outsider in the very town that raised her. Yet despite all this, Susan refused to move. "Why should I leave because of a few daft laddies?" she told reporters defiantly. But behind her strong words lay real fear and exhaustion. No amount of album sales or global applause could shield her from the relentless invasion of her peace. In her mind, home was supposed to be sacred, but fame made her a target, turning that sanctuary into yet another battlefield. As the spotlight dimmed and the years passed, Susan Boyle's battle shifted from public pressure to private endurance, facing a slow but sobering health decline that altered the trajectory of her life. In 2013, at the height of her recording success, she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a diagnosis that forced her to re-examine her lifestyle and confront her mortality. For a woman who had long found comfort in small pleasures like chocolate, giving up even her one indulgence became a symbolic sacrifice. And then came the COVID-19 pandemic, a nightmare for someone with her condition. Suddenly categorized as clinically vulnerable, Susan was told in no uncertain terms to shield herself indoors. So, like many with underlying health issues, she disappeared from public life and retreated into isolation. "I've tried to stay indoors as much as possible," she told the Edinburgh Evening News in 2021, candidly admitting that the threat of catching the virus haunted her. But it wasn't just physical health that suffered, it was the emotional strain of solitude. Susan described her days as staring at the same four walls, a grim routine that deepened her sense of disconnection from the world that once cheered. For her, the same voice that had captivated millions now echoed in silence, confined to a home where the only sound was her own thoughts. Despite having sold millions of albums and performed for royalty, she found herself battling a very human, very relatable fear that life was quietly passing her by. And through it all, she never complained, never demanded pity. She simply endured, because that's what Susan Boyle has always done. But the cost of that endurance, the emotional and physical toll of chronic illness and prolonged isolation, has quietly written yet another tragic chapter in the life of a woman the world never truly protected. Despite the harsh spotlight, personal loss, health battles, and mental breakdowns, Susan Boyle's resilience remains as one of the most remarkable elements of her story. A quiet, persistent strength that continues to define her, even as the world's attention has moved on. After the loss of her beloved sister Bridie in 2015, the last familial anchor she leaned on, Susan took a step back from recording, choosing instead to focus on her inner circle and what little piece she could salvage. Her niece Joanne, who also served as her assistant, became a vital source of support during this time of mourning and reflection. And although the mainstream press no longer hounds her door and her chart-topping days are behind her, Susan has never given up music. In 2016, she released her 7th studio album, A Wonderful World, which featured duets with Michael Bolton and even a posthumous collaboration with Nat King Cole. But even with new music, her public appearances became rare, and the myth of Susan Boyle, the overnight sensation, gradually faded into the background noise of the entertainment industry. What never faded, however, was the impact she made. Her story, filled with more pain than most knew, remains a beacon for anyone who has ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or misunderstood. While she may never headline sold-out arenas again or trend on social media, she stands as living proof that talent can erupt from the unlikeliest of places, and that strength often wears the face of someone who has cried in silence. Susan Boyle may no longer dominate the charts, but her legacy is eternal. She didn't just sing, she survived. And in doing so, she reminded the world that beneath every underdog lies a force too powerful to ignore. Even if the world only noticed